18th century poetry. The Metaphysical Poets. These were a circle of poets active between 1610 and 1670. As you can see here, somewhere covering the period of the Jacobean era, the Caroline era, and the interregnum, and the first years of the Restoration. Their name Metaphysical Poets, comes from the word metaphysics. And if we take a look in a dictionary, metaphysics is described as follows. Metaphysics is a part of philosophy which is concerned with understanding reality and developing theories about what exists and how we know that it exists. So why is this metaphysical poetry? Metaphysics, in other words, is what is beyond or above physics. It's a branch of philosophy that deals with the first principles of things, including abstract concepts such as being, knowing, identity, time, and space. But the term was first used as a derogative term, almost like an insult, to refer to these poets that approached unusual poetic themes. So, metaphysical, therefore, was an ironic name these poets were given by their critics, who thought their poetry to be pompous, affected, and insincere. Critic Samuel Johnson looked down on them, and he said, "The metaphysical poets were men of learning, and to show their learning was their whole endeavor." So in other words, all they wanted to do was to show how educated they were. And he added, "Their thoughts are often new, but seldom natural. They are not obvious." So he seems to be criticizing here the lack of clarity of his poets, or maybe their ambiguity. Another artist, this one, poet and critic John Dryden, also looked down on these poets. And he said about poet John Donne, "Donne affects the metaphysics, not only in his satires, but also in his amorous verses." The word affects would indicate fakery, imitation, just pretends to be philosophical. And why does he do that? And it's John Dryden who explains it again. He says, "He perplexes the mind of the fair sex," the ladies, "with nice speculations of philosophy." So the metaphysical poets are John Donne, then Andrew Marvell, and George Herbert, and then Richard Crashaw, and Robert Herrick. And you can see their years of their lives. Now, if we put them on a timeline like this one, we will notice something very interesting. These authors, as you will see in a minute, are not at all contemporary. The oldest of them, John Donne, was just 8 years younger than William Shakespeare, and he died about 15 years after Shakespeare's death. Robert Herrick, however, was nearly 20 years younger than John Donne. When George Herbert was born, Donne was 21. Richard Crusho belongs to an entirely different generation. He was born 40 years after John Donne. And the last great name of the metaphysical poetry, Andrew Marvell, was born in 1621 when John Donne was nearly 50. is a completely different generation, and he outlived them all, living until 1678, which is 40 years after John Donne's death. So what does this timeline tell us? This timeline reveals that these poets were members of different generations, that they were not contemporary, that they did not work together, that the name of this circle, Metaphysical Poets, it's not a name of their choosing. The name Metaphysical, as we have seen, was given to them by a posterity who no longer resonated with their art and who was hostile to them. John Donne is considered to be the founder of the metaphysical school of poetry. This portrait presents the one facet of Donne that has remained the most popular with the public, that of the melancholy lover that he projected in many of his poems, a fascinating man possessing a charming way with words, ready to use it to reach the objects of his love. We can see this facet in his sly and perplexing love poems like Love's Alchemy, The Anniversary, A Valediction, or The Flea. A contemporary once called him a great visitor of ladies, a great frequenter of plays, and a great writer of conceited verses. To many critics, Donne remains to this day the greatest love poet in English literature. As a young man, Donne attended Oxford University for 3 years, and then Cambridge University. He could not take the degree in philosophy he expected because he was a Roman Catholic at a time when priests were required to swear loyalty to the Protestant queen. His relation with religion was complicated. He moved from religious skepticism to religious fervor. As a young man, he took part in some military expeditions at sea, of which one was close to piracy. He became the secretary of an official at the court, then married a 16-year-old girl who was disowned by her parents and who was to bear him 12 children. Donne lost his job, lived in poverty, at the mercy of rich patrons. Just before turning 40, he converted to the Anglican faith, was ordained a priest, and became the dean of St. Patrick's Cathedral. His poetry includes elegies, satires, and verse letters. Apart from Anniversaries, published in 1611, all his poetry was published in 1633, after his death, under the title Poems with Elegies on the author's death. This poetry, whether about love or religion, had an innovative experimental side, as it integrates Donne's vast knowledge of science, alchemy, geography, and philosophy. His poetry is surprisingly modern and occasionally even shocking. Andrew Marvell is the last of the metaphysical poets and one of the greatest. He too attended Cambridge but had no academic career afterwards. As a young man, he traveled abroad to Italy, France, Germany, and the Netherlands for at least 5 years as a private tutor, or, as some suggest, as a spy. After the Revolution, during the interregnum, Marvell was close to Lord Protector Oliver Cromwell, to whom he dedicated 2 odes. He was appointed assistant to John Milton, the great poet John Milton, as a Latin secretary in the Foreign Office, and later, when the revolution was defeated, he seems to have saved Milton from prison. During his time, he was mostly remarked for his satirical poems. However, nowadays, his reputation rests mostly on his lyrical verse. His poem, To His Coy Mistress, is considered one of the greatest English poems on the theme of Carpe Diem, enjoy the day. His love poems are often ironic or bitter, and they speak of the estrangement of the lovers or of the war of the sexes, in verses of daring imagery that mingle the sensual with the philosophical, the erotic with the scientific abstract. George Herbert was born in Wales, studied at Trinity College, Cambridge, graduated with an BA and an MA degree, and became the university's orator, like a public speaker. He wrote poetry both in Latin and English. An Anglican, Herbert felt Roman Catholicism and Puritanism as dangerous to his religion. He became a deacon, a position within the church, and received a crown grant. Herbert's poetry orbits around religious faith, often in anxious terms, with passionate meditations about his desire to satisfy God's divine plans. With the exception of Memoriae Matris Sacrum, all of Herbert's poetry was published after his death. Herbert published the volume The Temple in 1633, The Priest to the Temple in 1652, and in this volume we have two very special poems, The Altar and The Sacrifice. And The Altar is a celebrated poem having a very unusual typography. As you can see, the lines are center aligned and they make up a strange design. And if we take a closer look, this would be a pulpit, the pulpit at which the priest celebrates Mass. And a similar thing happens with a poem entitled Easter Wings, which suggests the wings of the angels, like these ones here. And if we have a look, these wings, we overlap them to the volume, and here what do we have? So the lines of the poem, are written vertically, and that the typography again is very peculiar, very special, because they resemble wings of angels. And we can see this, no matter how we look. This is another edition, and again we can pretty much see the same very unusual format. Such graphically designed poems anticipate some work we will see in the 20th century, such as the one by French poet Guillaume Apollinaire with his calligram poems, in which the typography, the pagination of the words mimic the shape of the objects. We'll also be seeing this in some modernist poets from America, like William Carlos Williams. Another member of the group is John Crashaw, a lesser known member of the group. We don't really have a very good portrait of him. This is a contemporary portrait, and he's the author of Steps to the Temple, a volume published originally in 1646. You see, a lot of these poems have to do with temple, church, because many of the metaphysical poets were priests, if not priests, ordained priests, they were theologians. They had theological education. They were very often inspired by the meditations on religion. Another member of this group, Robert Herrick, born in 1591, he died in 1674, and Herrick is, as you can see here, we have this very interesting frontispiece in one of his books showing Herrick being coronated like some kind of king of poetry. This looks almost ironic today, I would say. He's the author of a volume inspired by Greek narrative, so-called Hesperides, published in 1648, which is included in that volume of his, Hesperides, or the works of both human and divine. In Herrick, we come across a famous line which was taken from Shakespeare: "Gather ye rosebuds while ye may, old time is still a-flying, and this same flower that smiles today, tomorrow will be dying." An invitation to enjoy life, to pick up its fruit, to pick up its flowers while we are still young. We'll be looking now at some literary terminology. And a very common term used to speak about some of the tropes they are using is the conceit. And this is a term that comes from the Italian concetto, coined in the 17th century, used mainly in Baroque art. Here's a definition. It's a figure of speech which establishes a striking parallel, usually ingeniously elaborate, between two very dissimilar things or situation. So it's a parallel. You might say it is like a simile or a metaphor but it's elaborated, it's exaggerated, it's kind of surprising because the things, the two members of the comparison are very dissimilar. They do not seem to fit. They seem to be contrasting, almost shocking. There are two types of conceits. Yeah, we know in literary history, the classical one is the so-called Petrarchan conceit, which was used by the Italian poet Petrarch, which is detailed, ingenious, and often exaggerated comparisons apply to the, in this case, to the disdainful mistress. And here's one example from Petrarch. I find no peace, and all my war is done. I fear and hope. I burn and freeze in ice. Lines in which Petrarch is not really speaking of any war, any military, and he's not speaking about seasons. He's speaking about love. The war is love suffering, the peace is, happiness, and burning and freezing, ice and fire are the contrasting emotions, are a metaphor for the contrasting emotions felt by the lovers. There is then the other conceit, and this is the one we have here, which was theorized by the critic Samuel Johnson. And this is the metaphysical conceit. And it's defined like this. It's a combination of dissimilar images or discovery of occult resemblances in things apparently unlike. The most heterogeneous ideas are yoked by violence together. This is the exact definition which was given by Samuel Johnson. Again, we find the idea that the two images, the two terms of the comparison should be dissimilar, and that there might be some kind of underground terrestrial similarity, yeah, between things, or that the correspondence between these things happens at a mystical or occult level. Here's an example coming from Crusho. Crusho compares Mary Magdalene's eyes weeping with a fountain, like the fountain you see below, and he calls those eyes two faithful fountains. And he goes on by calling those eyes two walking baths, two weeping motions. And this is already going very far. How much is Mary Magdalene weeping after all? Because now her eyes produce like baths, maybe like these ones. Yeah, think of those public baths in Renaissance castles. And he goes on by calling them portable and compendious oceans. And this is really going very far. Yeah, there's so much tears running from those eyes that they make up oceans, and those oceans are portable because Mary Magdalene is taking them with her wherever she goes. Of course, this is over the top, this is exaggerated, and it can provoke either surprise, shock, or it can even provoke laughter. It could look a bit almost ridiculous. And this is somehow one of the reasons why the metaphysical poets were called metaphysical, yeah, because they were going very, very far. And here's another example of a conceit. It comes from the definition of love for fate. With jealous eyes thou see two perfect loves, nor lets them close. It's an image of fate, a divinity, contemplating the lovers and kind of deciding upon their union. Their union, her ruin be, and her tyrannic power depose. The idea would be that fate, which in this painting is represented as a Greek god, is supervising the two lovers. It doesn't let them come closer because fate is meant to rule people's life, to have control over their lives. And if the lovers might unite, then the power of this god, fate, would cease, would stop. And here's another interesting conceit, where love is compared to geometry. As lines, so love, oblique may well themselves in every angle meet. So the loves, each person's affection is described as a line, and the man's line and the woman's line, and they generally meet in various angles, like from geometry. You can discover these angles, if you wish, in this Baroque painting, where you see the various angles in composition. And you can see also the angles in the two persons' eye lines. This is a poem about unhappy lovers, because their loves are parallel. But ours are so truly parallel. So the man's affection and the woman's affection, they are parallel, and thus they would never meet. They would never find a convergence point. Yeah, it's interesting how love is reduced to a problem of geometry, and unfulfilled, unrequited love is transformed into a matter of geometrical parallels. And of course, being infinite, thou infinite, they can never meet. The sad fate of these lovers. Instead of using emotional language, the poet uses the precise language of geometry. Here's another example. And therefore her decrees of steel, as the distant poles have placed, thou love's whole world on us doth will, not by themselves to be embraced. So this is an image where the original plane geometry, two-dimensional geometry, is transferred to the third dimension. And the image of the globe, of the earth as a sphere turning around two poles, was well known already to these post-Copernican people. And the image here speaks again of the two lovers, the man and the woman, who are like the opposite poles, distant poles of a globe. They have been placed at the opposite poles by the decrees, by the laws of this God fate. And it's true, he adds between brackets, that our love is turning on an axis defined by these poles, see the geometry, but at the same time, being located at the opposite poles, they cannot meet. The man and the woman will never embrace, will never meet, because they are in opposite positions. And again, geometry and geography are used here to speak about an impossible, unrequited love. We will have to wait several centuries until the early 1900s, when in 1921, the long neglect, the long eclipse that the metaphysical poets had over 3 centuries started to be dispelled, started to disappear. And the person who was responsible for that was the great British poet T.S. Eliot, in an essay entitled The Metaphysical Poets. And there he launched a notion which is crucial for our understanding of the metaphysical poets. He calls that dissociation of sensibility. This notion goes like this. The metaphysical poets, he says, had felt their thoughts as immediately as the color of the rose. And this phenomenon, the direct sensuous apprehension of thought, or the fusion of thought and feeling, was called by Eliot a mechanism of sensibility. In other words, Eliot felt that the metaphysical poets were able to speak about philosophy, therefore about intellect or about spirituality, in a way that was very approachable. And they used a set of figures, of images, that is very similar to the images that they would be using to speak about emotions, to speak about sentiment. T.S. Eliot noted that today we think of the intellectual poet and the reflective poet as being two very different species. And he says, and this happened because the unified sensibility which existed at the time of the metaphysical poets was dissociated, was broken, split. What Eliot is speaking about is the difference between the emotive artist and the reflective artist. So the emotive artist would be the artist of the heart, and the reflective artist would be the artist of the mind, of the intellect. These are very different artists. The emotive artist responds to emotions, to sensations, to sentiments, to anything that troubles him, whether at the pure level of senses or that of emotions. Whereas the reflective artist is the intellectual, the one writing philosophical poetry, religious poetry, mystical, metaphysical poetry. And between them, you now have this gap. These are now inhabiting totally different territories. Eliot explains that something happened to the mind of England between the time of Donne, as we see, Donne was active in the first part of the 1600s, and the time of Tennyson, important Victorian poet, active in the second half of the 19th century. And that's something, which I pictured here with those green question marks. That something is some kind of catastrophe, because it split the sensibilities. That something which happened somewhere in the 1700s is the dissociation of sensibility, is the break, the rupture of that unified sensibility plus intellect, as they existed in the metaphysical poets. And he goes on to say, so that from that point on, sensibility ceased to be unified, was no longer unified, and poets thought and felt by fits, unbalanced by fits, in jumps, in disrupted motions, and there was no more balance. And again, if we go back to this timeline, we see that in the early history of British literature, the artists like Shakespeare were both emotive and reflective artists. And they had this unified sensibility. They were able to speak about morality and emotion. They were able, at the same time, they were able to speak about philosophy and sentiment at the same time, or about love and religion. It was possible. All of these existed within themselves. But then, around the 1700s, you had that gap, you had that trench separating, destroying this unified sensibility. And from this point on, we will have two types of poets. One of them being, as I said earlier, the emotive artist, and the second one being the reflective artist. So this is the cataclysm, the catastrophe that Eliot deplored, Eliot felt so bad about. And along with Shakespeare, under unified sensibility, we also discover we are speaking about the metaphysical poets. Shakespeare, the metaphysical poets, had unified sensibility. Any other poet from the 1700s onwards was either an emotive artist or a reflective one. Eliot sums up, in the 17th century, a dissociation of sensibility established itself, from which we have never recovered. It's ongoing. While the language became more refined, the feeling became more crude. And as you can see here, Eliot is deploring this dissociation of sensibility as a loss. The language has become more sophisticated, much abler to express sophisticated, complicated emotions, but at the same time, the feeling became more simplistic, more crude. Now, if we are to look at these people in the context of Europe, in Europe, the metaphysical poets correspond to the poetry written by the Spanish poet Luis de Góngora, which invented a style called Gongorism, manifest with the cultivation of paradox, wordplay, elaborated metaphors, those concettos, and then artificial style and such things. In Italy, we have another similar poet, Giambattista Marino, who cultivated a very similar style. So as you can see, the metaphysical poets were not alone. They were part of something bigger. this movement towards a very witty, intelligent, sophisticated, elaborated poetry in which style and artifice dominated over the value of a realism or over even the notion of truth or morality. These people belong to a current, and if we look to the wide artistic current, this is the literary side of a much wider current called Baroque. The Baroque art, which is full of expressivity, often dramatic, operatic, decorative. In architecture and sculpture, you have an excess of decoration, an excess of expressivity, and in literature, you have this often excessively sophisticated, complicated, and shocking language you discover in these poets. There is another name we use to the literary component of the Baroque, and that is mannerism. Mannerism is often defined as a third term which could intervene in the binary opposition between realism and romantic. You probably know that realist and romantic have been used also to describe not just the realism of the 19th century, not just the romanticism of the beginning of the 19th century, but they were regarded as permanent poles between which human sensibility had oscillated. Yeah, we speak of classic and romantic, or some critics speak of a third term, and that would be mannerism, represented by people like these ones. So these were the metaphysical poets, artists of very sly art, often hiding themselves beneath images that might shock us. Poets who now seem to be speaking to us again.